Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Woodburn Accountants and Advisors webinar series on developing effective e-commerce sales strategies in China. E-commerce business models of all types are thriving, and sales from online stores are expected to increase 78% by 2020. It's easy to get caught up and excited in the latest trends, but unless you know the fundamentals, you will hit a wall without knowing it. A booming e-commerce business, it takes intuition, knowledge of the market, a solid business plan, a careful research into products, and into the business models that can be created, as we discussed in yesterday's webinar session. But one of the biggest hurdles most newcomers to the space face is communication. And I'm very pleased today to have Ting Zheng from Crayfish, who will present to us on the effective communication in China. But before we begin today's session, I would just like to go through a couple of administration points. You are using a GoToWebinar software system. When you entered, you would have been given a choice of choosing your audio option. You can either choose your computer's audio system or you can use a telephone landline. If you want to use your landline, you will have a number to dial in, an access code, and an audio PIN. Generally speaking, if you are based in China, you will have to use a VPN in order to log in into the GoToWebinar system. If you're not using a VPN, then do expect technical difficulties. As is with any online system, there will be some technical discrepancies with sound and potentially with the lag in slides. Please do stay on the line. We will always try to solve the technical issues. It usually takes around 30 seconds to 1 minute to solve. Today's webinar session is being recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel upon completion. Please don't be shy. Add your questions and comments into the questions section of the control panel. We aim to have a 10 to 15 minute Q&A. Hopefully we'll get to that, and we will then answer the questions. If we don't get to your questions directly in today's session, please don't worry. Ting, if the questions are directed at Ting or if the questions are directed at myself, we will answer you them directly following this webinar session. So let's begin with a bit of a test. If you all can hear me, please click on the hand button in your control panel. That will allow me to know that you're listening in. Thank you very much. Please re-click on the hand button, and this will then remove the hand icon from your control panel. Let's begin today's session. A brief introduction to who we are. Woodburn Accountants and Advisors is a specialized inbound investment firm for Hong Kong and China. We offer companies, whether they're small, medium-sized, or multinational, a one-stop approach to their corporate services needs. Everything from market entry advisory, pre-investment advisory, all the way to implementation and ongoing corporate accounting and tax services. There is no one company that is unique in China, and we try to offer tailor-made solutions and services to help our clients. A little bit about myself. I'm going to be the moderator for today's session, and my name is Christina Kohler-Coluccia. I am the head of business advisory at Woodburn Accountants and Advisors. I've been dealing in the Chinese market since 2003, solely in this business of corporate services. Instead of reading up on my profile and my bio, one of the things that I like to do on this slide is explain to you what I've learned in the 15 years of doing business in China. The first thing that I've learned about being in China is patience. And hopefully, and maybe Ting will be touching on this subject in her presentation today. I had to learn patience very quickly on. Even though I've been born and raised in Hong Kong and I'm a Westerner, I was frustrated from day one of entering the market with all aspects in my personal life as well as in my professional life. And one of the things I truly had to learn was patience. I believe that a lot of the Chinese know that there is such a lack of patience in the Western world, that they do enjoy and do take advantage of it at certain times. The second thing that I've learned is being detailed oriented. And naturally this comes with the sector that I'm in, which is, the corporate services sector where everything is related to administration. But one thing you have to be aware of, because you are in a different culture, a different environment, and in a different language base, you've got to make sure that you have an eye on detail, that you read things, that you are inquisitive, that you're curious, that you ask questions. One thing that frustrates me a lot now is when clients say, well, we just did it because, well, this is China. Yeah, it is China, but things are definitely becoming much more modern, and you should be aware of what is going on within your business. There are no more excuses of saying that this is just China. The last thing I've learned in China is the following. Whether it's been my business, whether it's been my clients' businesses, whether it's been my friends' businesses, everybody has had an obstacle that has come in their way. It's just how it works in China. There are obstacles that pop up on a daily basis. Now, instead of looking at blaming someone, which is a very Western thing to do, blaming someone that nobody predicted that so-and-so would happen, everybody loses focus and loses time and loses efficiency on actually trying to find a loophole to this blockage. And from my perspective, being in China for 15 years, definitely what I've learned is with any obstacle that arises, you will find a loophole. You will find a solution. You may not be happy with that solution, but you will find one. And instead of spending time, emotion on the negative aspects of trying to blame someone or fire someone, you've got to look at the positive aspects in terms of how to conquer that obstacle and move forward. And the nice thing in China is that you have the capability of doing that. Well, I'm going to stop talking now. And I'm now going to lead Ting into today's presentation. Ting?
Hi, Christina.
Hi, Ting, we can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Okay, thank you, Christina. Hello, everyone. My name is Ting Zhang. I'm the CEO and founder of crayfish.io. We are a new way of helping businesses in the West to connect with China. My own background has been doing that for the last 20 years through starting a consulting company and working with businesses in Europe, in the UK, as well as government agencies to form commercial links with China. But then I realized there's a lot more companies and businesses across the Europe, UK, even in other parts, for example, US, who wanted to help with China, but cannot always access the right expertise in time and also with the right budget level that suits them. So I launched crayfish.io about 2 years ago, which uses an online platform to deliver those Chinese business expertise in a time efficient way, but also enable a wider reach. So next. So just a little bit about what crayfish.io actually does. We, as an online platform, we have on one hand businesses all looking to develop more successful business in China, but on the other hand, we have a global pool of talent who are professional Chinese-speaking, multilingual, multicultural professionals who can be hired to work on all kinds of projects. On the other hand, we also have a network of vetted suppliers who are small niche agencies who can also provide those services. And the marketplace itself has a clever engine that matches the requirement of service with the right provider, and with all the payment handled online. So that it's how the platform itself performs. Next, please. In terms of services, we are a full service provider in that we can help companies right from the strategy level to all the way through planning and at operation level in all aspects of business services. So if you think about it, if you're looking for goods manufactured in China or other parts of the world, you can use Alibaba.com. But for expertise, business expertise and services, there isn't such a place to go to online. So Crayfish aims to fill that gap. But we do also have tailored services where we provide offline and personal relationship managed services as well. And we work with partners such as Woodburn and other professional service providers to make sure that the clients get the best service they need. Next. So with that, now I would like to share with you my observation and some of my experience in facilitating the communication and business links between the West and China in my last 20 years in this space. Next, please. There are various ways that companies or individuals, institutions interact with China, but typically these are either you are selling to China or sourcing from China, or you're looking to acquire or being acquired, invest or being invested by Chinese investors. Sometimes you could be in technology licensing, technology transfer, but also in education and culture exchanges. Next, but through all these various types of collaborations, most importantly is really to have the right way to communicate. If you look at this this is the model we have developed at Crayfish, we call 4C model, where all these different aspects are important to make sure that you do business in China successfully. The cultural aspect is the context where you also combined with different styles of management, as well as different laws and regulations, combined with the distance and time differences, makes the context very important to understand. In retail, in e-commerce, there are regulations that typically are different from what we see here. China in general is more regulated economy, so you need to be aware of those, and so you can navigate in those. In terms of content, it's important to have a strategy for China, and the content of that strategy needs to be well developed, but also understood and shared with your partners in China. And that is important to have the right way to communicate, as I mentioned. And of course, this involves communicating with your own stakeholders, your internal organization, but also with the general public. And if not handled properly, it can be disastrous. And finally, with all these elements looked after and well prepared, you still need, most important is talent to help that happen. People who facilitate your relationship transactions with China, or implement those strategies and plans you have in place, and to have the right organization structure, bear in mind of the Chinese culture as well. So we will touch upon some of this in the following slides. Next. So this is just a quick slide to show you that China has a long history, and the Chinese people believe in 5,000 years of civilization. And that's why there's a lot of wisdom and accumulated over the years that's embedded in the way the Chinese people think, behave, and act. But we will talk through about this, but these are just some key events, sort of years that might be helpful for you to understand. I just want to highlight 2001, that's when China into WTO. And since then, China has gone through enormous changes till its economic state today. And next. And so in terms of today, as you know, China is the second largest economy, and it's forecasted that China will overtake US to become the biggest economy in about 10 years' time. And that's probably why you're seeing now the trade war happening to fight for the #1 place in the coming years. But also, I just want to also touch upon this, that when you go to China, if you have been there, you will notice that there's a perfect blend of the traditional China and the modern side of it. You can experience those when you wander off any modern big street lighted with shopping malls. But then if you've gone beyond that, just into little alleyways, you can see the sort of much more traditional part of China. And so that's also where you will find huge income gaps in China. There's a lot of wealth being created and have been created in the last 2 decades of economic development. But in the meantime, if you go to the countryside or further away from the cities, then there's a lot of poverty still. So there's a combination, and Chinese government is trying to tackle those, and one of the ways for the government is doing that is to use the Belt and Road Initiative, so that it actually develops more a Chinese economy on the west to and going overflow to the countries along that route. There's a lot of literature and events about Belt and Road Initiative. I won't be talking about that. But one of the points on this slide I want to talk is also the third one, which is the trust in government, in citizen, from citizen. This is quite different in that in the UK, for example, people don't always trust the government says, but in China, that is actually people do listen to the government and they do trust the government. I will tell you why in the next slides. Next, please. So this is where I want to just very briefly to say that I understand most people probably know about Confucius, but it's really important to know that the Confucianism actually forms the foundation of Chinese way of thinking, but it's not actually religion. It's really a set of philosophy and ideology developed over 2,500 years. So, for example, one of the important things is respect of our hierarchy and power. And so people over these thousands of years, Chinese people have been used to listen to the in old days emperor, nowadays the government. So they do have that respect and trust. And so when doing business in China, endorsed by government is always a very useful thing. And of course, respect for tradition and age, again, that is part of the sort of important philosophy in China. So, for example, if you are selling a brand into China to show that tradition and history of the brand is very, very helpful. Next. So we talk about China being a very bureaucratic society, also very regulated economy. So there is quite an uneven distribution of power between, for example, the government and business. So doing business in China usually requires good connection, which in China knows guanxi. Literally, these two words just means gate to connection. And people may think is guanxi. We know that guanxi used to be really important in everything in China, but is it still relevant today? The answer is yes, it is still important, although less critical in certain aspects of doing business. So if your business involves getting endorsement from key players and government, then that guanxi is very important. But on a personal level, if you want to have a successful relationship with your business partner, and that guanxi is still very important to build. And this is not just talking about people to people relationship. We are also talking about organization to organization. So a brand, a big brand, can have a very good relationship with the Chinese government, and that can be seen from all the key, all the large multinationals who would have actually a government sort of affairs department who handles that relationship in an institutional way. And so here are just a picture here. It's not so much in sort of e-commerce related, but I just want to show you that having the right relationship to the key people brings opens the door more quickly. In this picture, we have a client who is in an educational product, and in order to get access to the university sector quickly, we introduce the client to vice president of a large university who was able to provide instant feedback, so saving a lot of time actually talking to university about whether this aspect of business is helpful or not. So, and making friends is always important in that aspect. And then next trip, then the client was already able to reach out to the same person, and then they can always already talk about doing business as old friends. So next. This is another key word for you to know in doing business in China. It's 面子, and that means face. So this in the e-commerce and retail aspect is actually very relevant. So for example, in China, a lot of young professionals, young girls would save their salary for months, probably only eating very simple, rice in their apartment in order to save money to buy a Louis Vuitton bag. And because they want to be shown to be, doing well, and they want to look good. So a lot of nowadays they call small town consumers. These are the younger generations who would spend most of the savings every month to buy luxury products or just things they saw on Tmall that looks nice, and they have this impulsive buy, and then they just show off in the social media. It's just all about earning that respect from their friends, looking good. And then on the right, I don't know if you have been to Chinese restaurant, occasionally you will see that people fighting over dinner table and actually for paying. And this is very unusual coming from the sort of Western perspective, where you either share or you agree beforehand who's going to pay, who invited the bill. But sometimes in the Chinese way, it's not always spoken at the beginning, and then at the end there will be a fight, and whoever end up paying, feeling that they would have got to the respect and the face. So that is an interesting element for you to observe next time. And of course, as usual, people don't want to tell the unpleasant things to other, to the public, etc. But this is even more so in the Chinese culture. So a lot of the things were swept sort of under the carpet, and that again is the aspect of face. However, it is changing, in that I will talk about later. And of course, giving face, this is actually it's almost like a contradictory, but as you know, there's a trade war between the US and China, and have been going on for a while, and will be probably going on for a while. But in critical times, on a personal level, as you can see, Trump always give the respect to President Xi, vice versa, when they host each other's visit. And when the president announced the constitution change in China, that he will be remaining president for a long, long time, and that was actually not criticized personally by Trump. It was with a positive comment. So that is actually a way to interpret it, that the face was given, and that is a personal respect. It's very important. Next, please. People may look at that event differently, but that's my take of the giving face of important people. So culturally, there are a lot of aspects that you may wanted to learn, but I just want to cover a few. This is all related to communication, because communication is based on the right understanding of each other, and then to have the right a series of events sometimes relate to that. So when you go to China, for example, you take some gifts. These are really intention only. It doesn't necessarily have to be expensive, but to just show you that you respect. And then when your partners or your customers visit you in the UK, you should always try to reciprocate that hospitality, which you normally would get when you go to China, such as like picking up from airport, or treating with a good meals, and taking them sightseeing. And that is more all important to have the relationship. And no matter how much you disagree with your partners or your customers or your stakeholders, try not to challenge them or criticize them in front of others, and because that will make them lose face. So that's important. And we talked about adapt to the Chinese culture. I just want to say, build a relationship doesn't mean you have to be, involved in things that could be seen as corruption. Particularly if you are advised by, whether your team or your advisors in China say this is how the Chinese people would do, and be careful if you don't feel it's right, seek advice, but don't do what Rome's do. In this case, don't do what the Chinese would do, because as foreign company, it will get much more publicized if anything goes wrong, and more heavily punished by the Chinese government. This you probably have seen the cases happening involving foreign brands, for example, even iPhone, etc. When there is any quality or any problem, it will get amplified. And finally, there are a lot of kickbacks, etc., in the supply chain and in the e-commerce area in China. And that actually has been exposed by the company. For example, JD.com and Alibaba.com both have actually exposed the corruption in their value chain, in the procurement system. And it was actually counter to the typical Chinese way of saying, don't wash your linen, dirty linen in public. I think in that aspect, it was welcomed in general by the society, that they are able to actually deal with that problem internally, to make aware that also the consumers will have more confidence in how the corporate governance of these big retailing giants are. Next. So here, just start talking about communication. The slides were supposed to be sort of coming out one by one, but with the webinar it's difficult. So what I want to say on these slides is in China nowadays, emails are very rarely used for daily communications. Unlike here, we write emails 1, 2, 3, long emails clearly sort of documenting what we're going to do, discuss. But in China, it's much more informal. You either pick up the phone to talk to them if they are in in the same time zone, easily done. But more so, if you have not used it, people use WeChat as a regular everyday communication for any business informal communication. Even documents, conference calls, videos, everything is used in this super app. But of course, nothing still compares to face-to-face. You go to meet each other. That is most important, to build that relationship, build that personal connection and trust and respect. Next, please. And so a little bit tip on make the sort of how do you make effective communication more sort of granular level. Don't write long messages on WeChat. Try to be very succinct. And because, as Christina mentioned, Chinese has a very short excuse me, there's not a lot of patience sometimes for reading long emails or long messages, so make it simple what you want to achieve. And with a lot of Chinese government or even big organizations such as Alibaba, JD.com, the hierarchy is that decision making involves various levels. So you need to maintain that communication at multiple levels. And ideally, if you have different levels of people working in your team, you would have a structure such as you, CEO, for example, would talk to their CEO, have a WeChat channel, talk to him personally, her personally, and then you have an operational level, a manager talking to their manager, sorting out a bit more detailed things, and then you would have another person, for example, assistant, admin, dealing with the admin assistant. So that is the best way to ensure that you communicate effectively, and then the key messages will get delivered to the key decision makers. And constant message is important because in China, everything happens so quickly, so many things happening. If you don't have regular communication, your message will get lost and people would forget what discussed with you. And culturally, it's important to be aware how to address people. For example, in China, you rarely address people by their full name. For example, if someone's called Wang Wei, in the Chinese order, Wang is surname, Wei is first name. You don't call him Wang Wei because that sounds very, almost like blunt. You either call them with the title. If they are a general manager, the Chinese people would call them Wang Zhong, which means general manager Wang. Or as a foreigner, you can just call them Wei, which is the first name. That's also acceptable. And if you're not sure, just call Mr. Wang. That's also fine. And also in your writing of the message, the WeChat is also important to show that, to address people correctly and to show the respect. Just want to say, the communication involves confidential information. In China, people will be happy to sign an NDA with you, but doesn't mean really they will keep the information confidential. Excuse me. This is also because the Chinese culture is people do business informally, people meet and talk. In competitors, people you also meet and share information. So if really confidential, do not share. That would be my advice. Next. And here I just wanted to say that because of the cultural difference, because of the language difference, it's really important to get your message understood accurately. And this can be branding, your brand image, this can be your product design, that message can be in the product design itself, and the content of your marketing message as well. But of course, on a detail level, when it comes to brochure, when it comes to business meetings, having the right translation or interpreting is really, really important. And having the time to prepare your interpreter in China, or make sure everything you take there is translated, will make your trip a lot more productive, make your communication much more quicker. If you send your Chinese partner documents in English, they will get it translated, typically internally, but then you wouldn't know how accurate this was translated. And so therefore, it's always better if you have them translated, and so you know they are good, and then send it them. If you are a brand and you are having very important branding message, or for example, your digital marketing message, this should not be just given to translating companies. This should be transcreated so that the core spirit in your messages are also carried out in the same way that you want it to be convened in your own language. So that is also important. People typically just give the documents to be translated and forgot about that. So, for example, in Crayfish, we handled a number of clients' communication, ongoing communication, whether these are WeChat public accounts, copywriting, or is consumer brands product design guidelines. These are all being handled with bear in mind of the Chinese culture of reading these messages and viewing these designs, and that sort of localization of messages is what our digital marketing team deals with for the clients on a daily basis. Next, please. Even now, with all these communications remotely, etc., we have seen a lot of need for people on the ground to actually dealing with communication on a day-to-day basis. And luckily, with the new generation in China, the gig economy is also spreading in the Chinese labor market. So we see a lot more younger generation do not follow in the typical 9 to 5 or 9 to 7 work pattern in China. They work for themselves, particularly now with e-commerce platform. They open their own business, selling probably a few brands, but they also take work for other brands, for other companies, and to combine their sort of career. And so we have actually done a research on that. This is published in the China-Britain Business Focus magazine with the article called The Rise of Freelancer, looking at how a Western business can tap into that pool of Chinese freelancing talent. For example, Crayfish has about 1,000 registered freelancers. Probably half of that are based in China. This can be people who are digital marketing specialists, copywriters, translators, marketeers, people who go and visit factories, do sourcing, quality control, but can also be designers, developers, and some of these people are doing this just for their sort of earning more income outside the normal hours. Some of them do this just as a portfolio of their career, but it's changing, and this is some trend worthwhile for you to be aware and for you to consider if you wanted to have to hire someone on the ground to help you develop business, but without incurring a full-time or even sort of regular part-time cost. Next. So just quickly touching on a few other aspects of doing business in China. This some of them involves communication, some of them actually is a result of successful communication. do spend time and efforts finding the right partner. Christina mentioned the patience, so you do need a lot of patience when doing business in China. If you want to sell your brands, your product into the Chinese e-commerce market, don't just go for whatever platform comes into your attention. There are multiple platforms, as you probably have heard in yesterday's workshop, webinar, or coming sessions. So take time, meet them, talk to them, and find the right one that suits you. Sometimes the big platform do not always suit a small brand. And so that is worthwhile to do that and do some comparison as well. Look at for your own business what is feasible, and do not take assumption that in a classical sense that Coca-Cola said, if 1 billion Chinese customer, every one customer buy one tin, it will be a billion customer. Not everyone in China will be your customers. Not everyone will buy your products or your brands. So they, but with the right research or the right partner, you are able probably to capture a portion of that market, and that would probably make your business already very successful, because China is huge, the market is enormous. Having a small pie is probably big enough for many British brands. And of course, you will be worried if you are going to, be on Tmall or JD.com, you will get copycats, that looks like you or sound like you. But that's normal, to be honest, doing business in China. Sometimes the normal risk you've got to bear in mind, the risk and return. You will have that risk, but having the products in and getting revenue is also important. Sometimes actually having the copycats is not necessarily a bad thing, because that in a way build the brands for you, even though you don't get the money at the beginning. If more people are aware of your brands, I think in the early days probably there'll be more people wearing fake Burberry than real Burberry 20 years ago. But now, of course, people have more money, they want to buy the real thing. So don't be too worried about having copycats. You can deal with those when you have the right resources. Of course, you can talk to the IP lawyers, having the right protection in place to register your trademarks and all that. But focus on build the market awareness for your brands. And if you are in the licensing model, then the sort of foreign exchange from the China government is more relevant to you. If you are licensing your brand for manufacturing in China, then that licensing agreement needs to you need to bear in mind it takes a lot of time for payment coming out of China for such agreement. So that is sort of on a transaction level, but in general, with doing business in China, with sort of building the relationship and guanxi and connection, build the trust, and be open-minded, because a lot of time the Chinese partner, whether they're your customers or your distributors, they may want to invest your company, they may want to take your company to China and make it part of their business, which is good news for you. So be open-minded for that aspect. I think that's all for my presentation. Oh, sorry, there's a case study added here. Yeah, so this is a case study. It's about a gaming business that eventually was going to be sold through the online gaming portal in a large Chinese gaming operator. So I use this case study to illustrate how important the cultural aspect in the communication, just on that aspect, because I mentioned early on, you don't always go and talk to the biggest player in the market. In this case, you know, they did talk to Tencent, which was biggest game operator, but they did not go with them. Instead, they went with a smaller publisher operator, which has the right sort of product fit with their own game, because that enables the company to access more support from the Chinese company, because the Chinese companies see their the UK product, the game, as a really important part of the overall strategy in the gaming market. That is the point of the right size of partner. So for your brands, it's also important to find the Chinese partner that actually would see your brands as important to the portfolio, not just one addition to the hundreds of thousands of category. And then no matter what products you're selling, whether it's e-commerce or technology or educational products, it's really important that you're committed from the top, from the management level. And because in China, you will need the commitment to build that relationship. So make sure that. I just wanted to touch upon the communication in terms of the contract, etc., terms. Again, if you are signing a distribute agreement with a Chinese partner, there will be terms that signed, agreed, and renegotiated, and then agreed and renegotiated again. And this is quite normal for the way the Chinese business see contract. So don't be sort of surprised, and make sure that if there's such renegotiation, always try to get something out of the concession for yourself. So if you give something, you take something. So in this case, in this case study, the Chinese party, after signed the agreement, wanted to change the payment terms. The UK company was not prepared to change, but with my advice, they did accept the change of payment terms, but instead they ask also for more marketing budget to spend in China. So that's how you can actually utilize the sort of the situation to make it more favorable to yourself as well. And there's as you can see, there's whiskey and there's tea there. What's the relevance here? This is, for example, the Chinese chairman coming to visit the UK to do the DD before signing a big distribution agreement, which is worth multiple $1 million. And the Chinese office calls me to say, Ting, what do we need to be aware of? Hosting, I said, first, of course, you need to take them to a nice meal, etc. But make sure you buy some Chinese tea, because they're not used to having coffee all day, and they do like to just sip the Chinese tea, go through the terms, because it's a long day of this negotiation office, and that went well. But when the UK CEO visited the Chinese a couple of times, and I advised them take some gifts, as we mentioned before, and knowing the Chinese side, the president personally well, I knew that he likes whiskey, so you advised the CEO to take some whiskey, and that went really well. And after long day negotiation, open the whiskey and celebrate. So that really helped build that bond. So the UK CEO and the Chinese president, which you can see on the picture, the two middle person, they built a good relationship. So later, when there was problem with payment, etc., they were able to solve it as a friendly relationship. So that is important. A general message to companies, doesn't matter you're in e-commerce or other aspect, is to having that relationship, and that helps you in a difficult times. The communication will get it to be really solving all the problems. So I think that's next. Yeah, that's it. So now we finish, and I'll hand over to Christy.
Ting, thank you very much for the presentation. So we've got about 11 minutes for the Q&A, and there were a couple of questions that came in throughout the presentation. So let's get started on some of the questions that came in. So one of the questions was, when you're having a business meeting, what should you actually be watching out for? Do you have any tips on how to handle business meetings?
Yes, so the first thing I would say, in my personal experience anyway, if you book a business meeting, if you are able to secure a slot 2 months in advance, that's very unusual. Normally you actually book it probably less short notice of that, but then make sure you confirm that, say, before your trip. And then when you get there, second day, your meeting happens and you confirm again that day. And actually, I would normally, even on the same day, confirm that I will see you later. Just this because sometimes people in China, particularly important people, tend to have priority of meetings. Sometimes they push things around, and if you don't confirm, you might suddenly get a notice or email chat to say we can't see you, or we have to change. So it's always good to confirm near the time. And then when you actually go to the meeting, you typically would see more than just one or two. Sometimes you have actually a lot of people sitting in the back, just observe or just listen to the meetings, and that is quite usual. But then you should always make sure you know who's the decision maker and talk to the decision maker, and not to interpreter, not to their interpreter or your interpreter. This is important to keep that sort of eye contact. And if you if it's possible, write the notes or ask the notes and confirm after the business meetings. Again, this is detail oriented, but make sure you do that, because otherwise what's discussed may be just forgotten.
Thank you, Ting. I've had the experience in a bunch of meetings in China where I'm usually the sole person sitting in the room, and there'll be 10 people facing me. And it can be very daunting and overwhelming when you've got a whole crowd of people in the room that you're supposed to be talking to. But what I've learned over the years is that a lot of the people in the room are also there to make sure I feel overwhelmed and daunted for negotiation purposes. They use that sometimes for their own leverage. Coming to the next question, China is huge. So when you're talking about communication, are there differences between communicating with the Chinese in Shanghai, or in Ningbo, or Wuhan, or Chongqing, or Chengdu? Are there these types of regional differences that people have to watch out for?
Yes, I think there are some stereotypes of how people talk. For example, you know, in the north, people are very talkative. For example, if you get in a taxi in Beijing, the taxi driver would talk to you about everything, politics to, you know, what's happening, you know, in Beijing, etc. But so people in the north typically are more sort of straightforward, and they would like to everything to say to you, yeah, no problem, etc. And generally more sort of make you feel warm, but that doesn't mean they are easier to negotiate. But in the south, if, for example, use a taxi example, you go to Shanghai, you rarely see the taxi driver actually talk to you about those things. They are sort of very, you know, sort of quiet, kind of just drive professional. So that's also the same with business. Typically are more sort of you know, how to say, more westernized, more professional, and less sort of chatting kind of building relationships that way. But in terms of also regional differences, there's for example, drinking. In the north, a lot of the business discussion can be done, you know, over dining table. A lot of drinking, particularly between you know, businessmen, and that then you know, can be very different from if you go to for example in Shanghai. You probably be less sort of cultural in such heavy drinking. And then if you're going to the south, for example, in Guangdong area, people are more pragmatic and they are more sort of business in that they're much more detailed. That's my observation. But then when you go to the west, it's people are more the pace is slower. For example, in Chengdu, so you probably, instead of a lot of heavy drinking plus or heavy drinking, you have time spent a lot of in tea house. People would take time, so they will be taking a lot more time to get to the point, and so you may get a quicker answer if you're dealing with someone in Shanghai than people dealing in Chengdu. What's your experience, Christina?
I mean, when you talked about the north, I was just recently in Tianjin, and actually the taxi driver would not be quiet. I mean, the whole 45-minute ride into the center of town, she told us about, gave us tips on restaurants, where to go, what to see, a little bit about the politics as well. So I think that's definitely something I would agree with. I think, in the end of the day, China is huge. Already from a religious perspective, you're looking at very different religions. So naturally, from a cultural perspective, there are differences. And from communication point of view, it will reflect on those cultural differences as well. So yeah, like I said, you just have to be patient with the differences that occur within the country. Well, let's move on to the next question, because I think this is something that is definitely of value for people that are doing currently their market research and are traveling around China. The question relates around translators. So the question is, should I bring my own translator with me on the trip, even though my counterpart, whether it's a customer or a supplier, will have their own translator on hand as well?
My experience from working with clients is, yes, definitely. It is really important to have a good translator on your side who works for you. This is because if you rely on other sides interpreter, there's no preparation that would have done to understand your branding, your product, your services. And bear in mind of the face element. If an interpreter who works for your counterpart doesn't understand your question or your comments, he or she would just skip it, because she or he doesn't want to sound stupid by asking you what this mean or appear to not to understand that. So you will probably lose your message in that. And sometimes they are also too scared probably to translate certain things that might affect their own position as well. And also nowadays, you don't have to sort of take someone all the way from UK or from Beijing to Guangzhou, for example. You can hire translators in those cities if possible to lower cost. But of course, if depending on what you are using the translators, interpreters for, you could have actually someone in China goes around in China with you, or having them in different cities. But now also you do have other ways to help you. For example, you have there are various hardware you can use, translators that you can use the handhold. You can do that online instantly, but still I would recommend have a human who understands your products and services, who totally aligned with you, and that can help you get exactly your message across and get the best outcome of your trip.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to reiterate what Ting has said. I completely agree. I think from my perspective, I'm still quite old-fashioned in terms of how things work in China, especially when it comes to meetings and negotiations. Having someone next to you who is on your side. But I think the critical point is having someone who is on your side, who understands your products, understands the terminology that needs to be used to discuss your product or your services, is also very, very critical. Yeah. I just want to mention one other aspect that I think is also important. having someone on your side that can listen in to the conversations that are occurring across the table is also to your advantage and your leverage. Having someone who can, I mean, I'll use the word act as a spy, is something that can be very, very useful, and has helped a lot of clients in terms of negotiations along the way.
Yes, I can echo that. We have, for example, clients who travel to China for meetings, and we, through Crayfish's own network of freelancing interpreters, we were able to find the exact right person in terms of the sector, in terms of availability and city, and that person can translate. But also, as you said, Christina, they can read, you know, the cultural, beyond the cultural nuances, and they can actually help advise sometimes what's really been said, what's really been discussed beyond, you know, just the sort of discussion, and that is actually also very useful as well.
Well, Ting, we're going to leave it there because we've just hit the hour, and I see some people are already starting to log off. So thank you very much for joining us today and presenting on, I think, this very important topic about communicating in China. So thank you, Ting.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you. Goodbye.
For those of you that are still on, again, if you've got any questions for Ting or myself, getting a copy of the slides, so you'll be able to reach out to us individually. For those where we were not able to answer your questions, please note that either Ting or myself will be contacting you directly to answer your questions. If you are interested in our webinar series or any of our promotions, please do follow us on all the various social media outlets. You can either follow me or you can follow our company pages as well. Last but not least, we have 3 additional sessions in this webinar series. Tomorrow and Thursday, we will have a individual from ANZ Law Firm who will be talking more about the legal nuances of e-commerce in China. And on Friday, I will be talking about the actual trade flow of shipping goods to China for cross-border e-commerce. I want to thank everyone for joining us, and I wish you a pleasant day. Thank you and goodbye.